Every time I come here, I'm so appreciative of the fact that so many of you have read the scriptures for us on a Sunday morning. I appreciate that because the scriptures are meant to be read out loud and they are meant to be heard in community. So I really am thankful for that. So this morning, I've asked Susan and Patrick Soken if they could read Esther 7 for us. So please listen as they read today's passage.
Esther 7, verses 1 to 6. So the king and Haman went in to feast with Queen Esther. On the second day, as they were drinking wine, the king again said to Esther, "What is your petition, Queen Esther? It shall be granted you. And what is your request? Even to half of my kingdom, it shall be fulfilled." Then Queen Esther answered, "If I have won your favor, O king, and it pleases the king, let my life be given me. That is my petition. And the lives of my people, that is my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. If we had been sold merely as slaves, men and women, I would have held my peace. But no enemy can compensate for this damage to the king." Then King Ahasuerus said to the Queen Esther, "Who is he, and where is he, and who has presumed to do this?" Esther said, "A foe and an enemy, this wicked Haman." Then Haman was terrified before the king and the queen.
The king rose from the feast in wrath and went into the palace garden. But Haman stayed to beg his life from Queen Esther, for he saw that the king had determined to destroy him. When the king returned from the palace garden to the banquet hall, Haman had thrown himself on the couch where Esther was reclining, and the king said, "Will he even assault the queen in my presence, in my own house?" As the words left the mouth of the king, they covered Haman's face. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs in attendance of the king, said, "Look, the very gallows that Haman has prepared for Mordecai, whose word saved the king, stands at Haman's house 50 cubits high." And the king said, "Hang him on that." So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the anger of the king abated.
Quite the story, huh? As I read Esther chapter 7, and as I listened to the sermons of the pastors who have preached in this series, my mind kind of raced almost immediately to what you call application questions. Those are questions that you apply the scriptures to your own life. You know, you ask yourself, what does this mean to me, and how can I apply it to my own self? So here are some of those questions that popped into my mind. What would real power feel like? Are there some powerful people that I know? Have I ever used influence and power in a negative way? If I'm close in proximity to power, how does that affect me? If I had power and any influence, how would I use it? Why do I hesitate to speak truthfully when it's important to do so? Why do I lack the courage sometimes to do what is right? How do I know when the time is right to speak with truth and wisdom? When do I speak up for myself? And what will it cost? Now, if I attempted to answer all those questions this morning, we'd be here till next week, so I won't answer all of them. But I do want to address 3 of these questions, if that's okay with you. And the first is this: how do I know when the right time is to speak with truth and wisdom? How do I know? In the book of Esther, timing is everything. The book of Esther is a dramatic story with all these twists and turns that you've already discovered. And if you can believe it, chapter 7 that we're in this morning takes it up a notch, and it puts us on the edge of our seat. Chapter 7 is the pivotal chapter of the story. But to get to this place, some things have to happen before. Others have shared with you in this series that God is never mentioned in the book of Esther, but that doesn't mean that God is absent. even before we get to chapter 7, God was really at work. And Esther had to patiently wait on God, patiently trust God, so that when chapter 7 arrives, King Ahasuerus is actually ready to hear from Queen Esther. We need to go back first to Esther chapter 3, where Haman, whom we know as the king's chief of staff, you might say, had earned the king's trust. So Haman, being as close as he was to power, wielded enormous authority and power himself. But there is a problem for Haman. There's one man who refuses to pay him homage and to bow down before him whenever he's around, and that man was Mordecai, the Jew. So Haman schemes to get rid of Mordecai and to get rid of all of Mordecai's kinfolks, the Jews. Haman uses his proximity to the powerful king to actually manipulate the king into sending out a royal decree, an executive order, to exterminate all of the Jews in the empire. But what Haman doesn't reveal to the king is what particular people group that he wanted to get rid of. His hidden agenda is nothing if not evil and destructive. And the next critical event overlaps in chapters 5 and 6. In chapter 5, Esther welcomes the king and Haman to an exclusive party. This is the first banquet. But she's not ready to address the king. At the party, Haman and the king get super intoxicated, which seems to be a recurring theme among the powerful and the wealthy. In chapter 6, when the king goes to bed, he cannot fall asleep. And so he has his aides read to him from their historical records. And Ahasuerus, the king, hears of how Mordecai uncovered an assassination plot on the king's life. And so Mordecai actually saves the king's life. And when the king hears the story again, I think he's thinking out loud, oh, I had forgotten all about that. And now, at the second banquet here in chapter 7, the time had arrived. The time was right. Esther reveals Haman's plot to the king in chapter 7. And guess what? The king had a visceral reaction. He had a visceral reaction. He's super ticked off right now, knowing how much Haman had manipulated him. And of course, God had to also plant the memory of Mordecai saving the king's life. So by the time we get to chapter 7, by the time Esther makes her request, the king had actually grown very affectionate of Esther, and she was his most favorite queen. But also he had developed a fondness by this time, having heard the story again, of Mordecai. And so the king could not let anything happen to Esther or to Mordecai. Esther had bided her time so that when she made the request of the king, he not only had pertinent information at his fingertips, but he had a lived experience. Esther was actually very thoughtful and very patient at arriving at this moment in time. She's very much unlike me, because I can be thoughtless. I know you don't think so. But I can be thoughtless and I can be very impetuous at times. How many of you are like that at times? Impetuous. I sometimes try to correct something or to correct someone without thinking it through. I just blurt out stuff sometimes. They call it diarrhea of the mouth, Sometimes just stuff comes out. Even with good intentions, if we haven't really thought through what we need to say or what we need to do, the consequences of our words and our actions can be much more hurtful than they can be helpful. If the person isn't prepared to hear what we have to say, oftentimes it's not going to go well. Patience, thoughtfulness, discernment, they're all critical things to right timing. So before we offer any words of advice, any words of truth, any words what we consider might be wisdom, there are things that we can do to prepare for that moment. One is to think about the way people have offered words to you, words of advice to you, when you needed them. How did people approach you? What kind of words did they say to you? And how did they say it to you? Try to remember that sharing advice and speaking truth to someone else is a dialogue. It's not a monologue. So if you're going to approach someone with the truth, to approach them with words of wisdom, just remember to be prepared to be in conversation with that person. Be ready to address their questions. Don't just tell them what you think they ought to do, but listen above all else. And then, of course, pray before you get to that point. Pray for God's wisdom and pray for God's discernment. The second question I want to address is this. If we have any power and any influence, how would I use it? If I have any power and any influence, how would I use it? So Esther in chapter 7 had come to her, as you've heard already from other passages, her Kairos moment, her God-appointed time. For a time as such as this, as Mordecai, her adopted father, had told her once. Everything had led now to this moment, being brought into the palace, being crowned as the queen, and being the king's most favored wife, coming into some standing with some authority, with some power and influence. How would Esther utilize it all? I just watched the movie Wicked 2, subtitled For Good. And the song For Good, I love that song, For Good, which is why the title is For Good. When her Kairos moment came, Esther used her power and influence for something good, the good of her people. She exposed Haman's plot to annihilate all the Jews, and she saved herself too, because she was a Jew herself. Because once a decree was made by the king, it could not be rescinded. But she spoke out, and she spoke out for all of her people. As Larry pointed out to us last week, we speak truth to power to seek justice for those who are in danger. And that is what Esther does exactly, to speak the truth to power and to save her people. Now I need to go back to chapter 5 just for a moment. You may not remember her, but her name is Zeresh. Remember Zeresh? Zeresh is Haman's wife. She's very prominent, although she's only gotten a few verses in 2 chapters. At the very first banquet that Esther threw for Haman and the king, Haman leaves the party intoxicated as usual. And he comes across his arch rival and his enemy, Mordecai. And once again, Mordecai refuses to bow down and pay Haman homage. And this just infuriates Haman. So when he gets home, he complains to his wife Zeresh and to his friends, some of whom we would assume are his advisors. And he recounts for them just how wealthy, how rich, how powerful he is. But he cannot enjoy any of those privileges because of one man, Mordecai. He feels like Mordecai is mocking him. So his wife Zeresh offers this suggestion in verse 14. Let a gallows 50 cubits high be made, and in the morning tell the king to have Mordecai hanged on it. Then go with the king to the banquet in good spirits. Does that surprise you that it's Zeresh who makes this suggestion? Not even his friends or advisors make this suggestion. Not even Haman himself comes up with this idea, but it is his wife, Zeresh. As Pastor Rebecca informed us a couple of Sundays ago, the gallows in Persia were not for hanging people necessarily by the neck, but it was a stake, a huge stake, and this was 75 feet high, when someone would be impaled on it, which is kind of gruesome when you think about it. It was used in the Persian Empire as public humiliation, and it was used as a deterrent. It was a message. Don't cross the empire, or this is where you're going to end up. It was a chilling and grotesque display of unchecked evil power. So why in the world would Haman's wife use her influence to suggest something so dramatic and so heinous? Here's a thought that occurred to me. We may already know that they were living in a very hierarchical, very patriarchal society. And in royal upscale households like Haman's, however, wives surprisingly had some influence and some sway. And it was very likely that Zeresh came from a very well-to-do family with tremendous status. So Zeresh was somewhat accustomed to fine things, to societal influence, to power, and to some privilege. So if Haman loses face, she loses face. If his standing in the community diminishes, her standing diminishes. So rather than using whatever influence that she had on her own husband for the good, she chose instead to protect her self-interests and her privilege. By not speaking with loving truth to her own husband, her husband died by the very gallows she suggested. And we learn 2 chapters later that her 10 sons were also killed. Perhaps she had become so comfortable and so enmeshed in being so close in proximity to power and having some power and influence herself that she had a difficult time seeing other people as people. She saw them as roadblocks. She saw them as enemies. She saw them as obstacles in her way. She couldn't give Haman sound advice and sage wisdom because, like so many powerful people do, she succumbed to the privileges and the benefits of power. In the year 1887, Lord John Edward Acton of the British Parliament wrote to the Anglican priest Bishop Mandell Creighton these words: "Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely." Lord Acton had observed that when a person's political, social, or economic power increases, their moral compass tends to diminish. Esther, through the years, living in the palace, so close in proximity to power, somehow, in some way, never lost her moral compass. God's Spirit managed to help Esther hold on to her godly core. So when her Kairos moment came, her inner fortitude and moral aptitude shone out like a beacon of hope. When it was time, she used her power and her influence for all that was good, and she saved an entire people. I know that we all have it in us. We all have that moral compass, our true north. We know what our faith requires of us: to do justice, and to love kindness, and to walk humbly with God. This is from Micah 6:8. That is what we can and must do with our influence and whatever authority and power God has given to us. And we are living in such a time when our moral fiber is actually being tested almost every single day. We are being tempted at every turn to blame all of our problems on those people. We can't do justice and we cannot love kindness until we see that all people are God's creation. And the last question I want to address is this. When I do speak up for myself, what will it cost? When I do speak up for myself, what will it cost? Years ago, I was down in Aptos, which is down the coast in Northern California, and I was at a little retreat, and there was a video store. Remember those? Yeah. And I went in, and there was a section called Manager's Specials, and I saw this. I'm going to pass this around so you can see it. Just make sure it comes back to me. And this movie became one of my all-time favorites, East Side Sushi. In this movie, Juana is a Mexican-American woman and a single mother of a young daughter. And her father also lives with them, and together they can barely make ends meet. So Juana applies for a job in a Japanese restaurant. By the way, one of her good friends is Aki, one of the chefs there, and he begins to greet her by Konnichiwa. But she's hired to be back of the house kitchen help. But she's super intrigued by the delicate form of sushi making. And so she watches from behind the curtain as Mr. Yoshida, who is the owner of the restaurant, and as her friend Aki, who is the executive sushi chef, create their sushi masterpieces. So at home every night, she tries to recreate what she has seen at the restaurant for her daughter and her father, who are not impressed initially. But eventually, with Aki's help in particular, Juana becomes very proficient in making sushi. She courageously steps out of the kitchen one night to ask Mr. Yoshida if it would be okay with him if she could apply for the assistant sushi chef position. But Mr. Yoshida, a traditionalist, a samurai, believes that only men can be sushi chefs. And so he cannot, so he cannot see Juana as a sushi chef. He says to her, "You were hired for the kitchen." Aki tries to intervene, telling Mr. Yoshida that the Mayan roll and the Bonita Bonita roll, they were Juana's creations, and they've become fan favorites. But Mr. Yoshida, he's unmoved. Exasperated, Juana says, "I deserve to be up front. I'm trying to have an opportunity like everybody else. You know, behind every great restaurant here, there are great Latinos in the kitchen, hidden, preparing the food and making you all look good. Well, I don't want to be in the back anymore. Hidden, in the back, invisible." How many of you have ever been made to feel that way? Like you don't really exist. And if you do, you only exist for the pleasure of others. Although Esther had lived in luxury, that is, by living in the palace, she was never free to be herself. Everything she was and everything she did was for the pleasure of the king. Like Juana in the movie, Esther was in the background, always doing things to make the king look good. To become queen, she had to protect and hide her identity as a Jew because of the Persian prejudice against this exiled minority group. But in chapter 7, she courageously steps out from behind the curtain and she reveals her ethnic identity. She is Jewish. And because of Haman and his devious plot, she will be killed alongside all of her kinfolk unless something miraculous happens. So now we might think, oh, no big deal. I mean, so she's a Jew. But when the king heard it, he could have felt like he was duped all along by Queen Esther. And with his enormous pride and power, he could have done to Esther what he had done to the first queen, Vashti. Remember her? She refused, Queen Vashti did, to basically be paraded naked in front of the king and all of his drunken frat boys. I may have shared this with you and hope that it's okay that I share it again. But many, many years ago, I was going through a very, very difficult passage in my life. I didn't really tell anybody about it at the time because I was ashamed. Fortunately, I was intelligent enough to go see a therapist. It may have been at least at the second session, maybe the third session of my time with the therapist. He said to me, if I were to diagnose your condition, I'd say that you're clinically depressed. And when he said that, he said he could also prescribe for me some medication to help me with my moods. But hearing the diagnosis that I may have been clinically depressed, while it was shocking, it was also somehow totally freeing. Something snapped in me, something good, actually. It felt like that in that moment when he identified it, I felt like this was my Kairos moment. This is my moment to live into my truth. And I could tell in that instant, I didn't need or I did not want medication for my condition. We actually live in an era where especially young people use social media platforms to share their opinions about everything and anything. And depending on how many likes they have, they think they have a lot of friends, at least in the ether sphere. Now, I'm no social scientist, but I would guess the deep connection is missing. True friendships and relationships are lacking. So ironically, loneliness and depression and death by suicide are very, very real issues. Did you know that death by suicide among men is 3 to 4 times higher than with women? Why is that? One word: shame. As males, we are often taught at home and in our culture, you got to man up, show no weakness. But in the long run, if we hide our vulnerabilities, it can keep us in the darkness. It can keep us hidden in the shadows. It takes courage to speak your truth, whatever that truth may be. It may cost your privacy. You might incur some judgment, but it may also unshackle you from your loneliness and isolation. In Esther's case, it not only freed her, but it made an impact on all the people in the empire. Who knows how many people you will help by sharing your journey, by sharing your struggles. And so may God grant you the courage then to speak power to truth, speak truth to power, and to speak your own truth for your soul's freedom. Please bow with me. I'd like to take us through a brief prayer exercise. I'm going to ask you to do 3 breaths in and 3 breaths out. First, I'd like you to take a breath in and imagine that you're taking in love, God's love. And as you breathe out apathy. Take a second breath in and imagine peace coming into your lungs. And as you breathe out anxiety. And then finally, as you breathe in this last and third breath, breathe in courage. And breathe out fear. Amen.